Hello again. In this chapter of 50 minerals that changed the course of history, we're going to be looking at alabaster. This is the fourth mineral we've been looking at, and we've looked at copper, we've looked at bronze, and we've looked at diamonds. Alabaster is not nearly as famous as those first three, but as you'll hear, it is quite influential in what we do in our everyday life, even today. At least the chemicals that make up alabaster, in a slightly different configuration, are things we still use today, as well as helping to lead to a lot of advances in early history. So now let the book do the talking. In modern usage, alabaster refers to two distinct minerals: gypsum alabaster, which is covered in a separate entry, so I'll tell that story later, and calcite alabaster, which is the subject of this entry. Long admired for its translucency and fine grain, alabaster was used in antiquity to make grave goods, statuary, and containers. Now these days we don't put too many goods in the grave, and we know that we can't take it with us, but in the olden days, whether the actual objects went or not, the idea was that the spiritual things that were attached to those objects would go with the spiritual part of us that departed our physical body, and so things that they could use in the afterlife. In any case, it was a sign of regard for those who had gone. Grave concerns is the first section. The ancient Egyptians developed extremely complex customs for the burial and aftercare of the dead. At first, the elaborate mummification process and its associated magical rituals, for instance, the construction of magnificent tombs and the provision of lavish grave goods, were reserved for the pharaoh and his immediate family. But in later periods, mummification became democratized. Nobles and commoners were embalmed and buried in sarcophagi in preparation for the afterlife. Sarcophagi means a sarcophagus, so think of a stone tomb. And by the way, the sign that this is shared by the ordinary people now just shows the kind of wealth and leisure time they had in order to make such things. Whether it was a useful thing or not, they had the wherewithal to do it. Central to these beliefs was the idea the physical body had to be preserved to ensure the survival of the deceased's spirit in the afterlife. We'll examine the process of mummification in detail in the entry on natron, which is another ancient substance that we know by another name now. But in addition to preserving the body, the muscles, the skeleton, the skin, the embalmers removed and preserved the major internal organs that would otherwise have decayed and led to the gradual deterioration of the corpse. So these were placed in containers known as canopic boxes, or jars, which were often made of alabaster. Egyptian medical knowledge, whatever their modern New Age admirers may claim, was limited. They believed the center of human consciousness was located in the heart, which was left inside the mummified body to be judged in the afterlife by the god Thought. That's T-H-O-T. The remaining internal organs were removed, embalmed, and placed in 4 separate containers, each dedicated to deities known as the Sons of Horus. The falcon-headed Quebensuf looked after the intestines. The jackal-headed Damutef looked after the stomach. The baboon-headed Hapi looked after the lungs, and Imseti, who had a human head, looked after the liver. So again, intestines, stomach, lungs, and liver, and also the heart. Other alabaster artifacts found in Egyptian tombs include statues, vases, and cosmetics bottles and jars. And now for the second section. Mummy Dearest. Some of the most extraordinary objects found in ancient Egypt are sarcophagi found hollowed out of giant blocks of alabaster. One of the finest, made for King Seti I, who died around 1300 BC, is now on display in Sir John Soane's Museum in London. I won't get into why Egyptian things are in London, but to continue. In 1925, archaeologists excavating on the Giza Plateau, on the outskirts of modern-day Cairo, discovered the burial chamber of the 4th dynasty Queen Hetepheres I. There were about 20 dynasties or more, so the 4th is very, very early, very ancient, longer BC than we are AD. Anyway, she was the mother of Khufu, who was the builder of the Great Pyramid, the biggest one of all. Now that burial chamber contained rich grave goods, including gilded furniture, so wooden furniture that had gold put over it. It had an alabaster canopic box, and it had a sealed alabaster sarcophagus. Overjoyed, the archaeologists thought they had discovered the first surviving royal mummy from the Pyramid Age. From the dimensions of the small chamber and the conditions of the tomb, archaeologists concluded this was a reburial after the queen's original tomb, probably near her husband's pyramid in Dashur, which was north of Giza, had been broken into and robbed soon after her burial. When they opened her sarcophagus, however, it was found to be empty. The robbers had removed the mummy to strip it of its golden jewelry and amulets, but the robbers had been disturbed before they could make off with the other precious grave goods. However, the presence of food offerings left by the pharaoh for his mother suggested the officials had not dared tell him his mother's mummy was missing. The empty coffin had been laboriously carried from Dashur to Giza, reburied in the new burial chamber 100 feet underground, without the pharaoh suspecting what had really happened. So even almost 5,000 years ago, there were grave robbers. So people have been ghoulish for a long time. Before glass became widely available, alabaster fulfilled several of its functions. So thin sheets of alabaster were used in windows. But its most common use was to make containers and vases. So fragile things that are quite pretty. In ancient Egypt, bulbous bottles modeled on the trunks of palm trees were carved from alabaster to hold cosmetics, scented oils, and perfumes. The Greeks called this type of bottle alabastron, after their Egyptian originals. But they manufactured them in pottery instead. They made it in glass, they made it in metal. Alabastra, based on Egyptian and Greek models, were made all over the ancient Near East and Europe. So, also in here is when Jesus was in Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, there came to him a woman having an alabaster box of very precious ointment, and she broke it and poured it on his head as he sat at his meal. Now, what is alabaster made out of? It is calcite, alabaster that we're talking about here, and calcite is quite simply calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate is a compound, a salt, made from calcium ions and carbonate anions. And carbonate itself is a carbon dioxide molecule with an extra oxygen attached to the carbon, along with its 2 extra electrons. Makes the whole thing quite stable. But when you put it into water, then it will react with the water, take away some of the hydrogens and move the oxygens around so that there'll be carbon dioxide bubbles moving around. And in general, it makes for a nice fizzy drink. So calcite, I wouldn't put it into your water to make it bubbly, but there's really nothing in there that is dangerous, and I guess that's why people could work with it and mold it between their fingers once it got wet, and let it harden again, and there you have it. It's not quite as soft as clay, of course, but it's quite easy to chisel and to mold. I think it's only about a 2 on the Mohs scale of hardness, so it's quite soft. But thank you for listening, and I hope that you have an excellent day whenever it is that you're listening to this.